At the center, we talked with our friends at FASB about kind of how to structure this day, and I wanted just to kind of give you a quick glimpse at our vision for these 4 sessions and the worship service that we'll pause for in the middle. We're going to start with a session about how the religious landscape is changing in this country and how that is changing the role that clergy play. Because we're thinking along the lines of this issue of professional ethics that David was talking about, we're thinking about how a profession is changing. Some of you are training to be religious professionals. Some of you work in that field. We're focused on the specific question today of what it means for clergy or religious professionals to respond faithfully in a time of authoritarianism. So we'll spend some time on that in this first session. After that, we're going to have a lecture on the role that clergy played in Germany in the 1930s during the rise of the Third Reich. So a close look at a moment of authoritarianism in history to see what we can learn from that experience. And after lunch, we have 2 more sessions. So a session that will be on the professions today, and going to have some folks who are not just clergy, but also in other professions who are going to be up here with Ken, who's with us, who's a real expert on professional ethics. Thanks for making the journey. So we'll have that conversation, and then following that, a conversation about some authoritarian moments in U.S. history. We have some historians coming to talk to us about the KKK in the 20th century and a moment of corporate fascism in the 1920s, and how in those moments communities came together to respond and the role that clergy played. And we're going to try to tease out together what we can glean from that history and from the rest of the conversation we've had about what sort of practices and institutions and networks we need today to be faithful in the face of the challenges we face. So that's the trajectory that we're on today. And to get started, I would like to introduce to you the Reverend Dr. Tony Lin, who is the Director of Research at the Center for Public Theology. He is a sociologist, so knows a bit about the religious landscape in the country, and has some colleagues he's going to introduce to help us shape this first conversation. So, Tony.
And I'll invite my colleagues to come up and sit up. The way we're framing this first panel is John Paul will give you a bit of a framing of what we think is happening. We all experience what's happening in religious life in America, but we're going to frame how we think things are changing. And then Dr. Larisha Hawkins will frame a little bit on why and how this is happening. And then we'll also have some conversation about what we can do, because we're all part of this country as we're living this, and we all have some agency in the religious institutions that we are part of. So, and we'll, after each of these this conversation, we'll give you time to talk around your table. So the first presenter will be John Paul LaPeña. He is a PhD student here at Yale in New Testament, and he's one of our research scholars here at the center. John Paul, what does John Paul do? His work examines how ancient Mediterranean discourse on the body, excess, and moral failures continue to shape modern conversations around health, stigma, and social worth, and in turn influences how communities respond to suffering. So, irrelevant.
Awesome. Yeah, awesome.
Dr. Larisha Hawkins is a political scientist from Lincoln University, and also the director for the Center for the Study of the Underground Railroad, which Lincoln University was in Pennsylvania, was one of the stops. She is a scholar, award-winning political scientist, professor, activist, and sought-after speakers and commentator on issues related to the intersection of race, politics, religion, and solidarity. So you can read the rest of their bios on the website. With that, I'll turn it over to John Paul.
Thanks, Tony. So in order to stay on time, I'm going to be reading from my presentation script. This is something I've been accustomed as a grad student here. So yeah, thanks everyone for being here. Good morning. I'll start us off with a brief overview of where religion in America stands. Today, not just in terms of decline or growth, but how people are resorting along ideological lines. Over the last decades, the big story was disaffiliation, people leaving the religion they were raised in, especially Christianity. But what's happening now is more subtle and arguably more important. We're seeing a resorting of belief and belonging. In other words, Americans are no longer just divided by denomination, they're clustering by worldview. I'll show the key numbers, then show how this sorting works. So let's start with where we are today. The conventional story says religion is declining in America, that we're becoming a secular nation, that Christianity is collapsing. But look at what the data actually shows. 62% of Americans still identify as Christian. That's a majority, not a collapse. Yes, 29% are religiously unaffiliated, the so-called nuns, but here's what's important. That growth has stabilized since around 2019, so the headline isn't collapse, it's reorganization. The question is, how are people reorganizing? Americans are resorting by ideology, not denomination. What do I mean by that? People are increasingly choosing where to worship based on whether a congregation shares their views on immigration, race, gender roles, LGBTQ inclusion, and what counts as legitimate political authority. You can see this how religion now tracks with party. The Republican coalition is predominantly white and Christian. The Democratic coalition is more religiously diverse, with the highest share of Christians of color and the highest share of religious unaffiliated. So denominational labels matter less than they used to. What matters more is what's your stance on these key moral issues. And then people find religious communities where those stances already make sense. Denominational labels tell us less, moral stance tells us more. So across the US, the biggest shifts in religion aren't happening through birth rates or conversions. They are happening through switching, people choosing to leave or realign their religious identity. And the reasons people give are not superficial. They are deeply moral and existential. Many exit for value-based reasons. They no longer believe in core teachings. They're troubled by the LGBTQ exclusion, or they feel spiritually or mentally harmed. Bottom line, decline often reflects credibility and trust, not apathy. So one of the clearest patterns we see in the data is that Americans are no longer primarily sorting by denomination. They're sorting by moral and political worldview. People cluster around how they understand immigration, race, gender, and democratic authority, and then they find congregations that reflect those commitments. On the political side, PRI studies show a very strong sorting pattern. The Republican coalition is still predominantly white and Christian, while the Democratic coalition is more religious diverse, including many Christians of color and the largest share of people who are unaffiliated. Now, this doesn't mean one group is more moral than the other. What it does mean is that they draw on different sources of moral authority. More religious Americans tend to see morality as grounded in scripture and enduring sacred principles. Less religious Americans tend to make moral judgments through reason, science, and shared humanitarian values. Because of this, we also see clustering around policy. More religious Americans tend to support smaller government and personal responsibility, while less religious Americans tend to support expanded social programs and collective provision. So the real challenge isn't disagreement, it's that people are beginning from different sources of moral guidance. Now I want to focus on one particular group that has become especially important in American politics, Christian nationalism. So with this graph, you see 4 groups, 4 lines. The red, the adherents, 10% of Americans who strongly affirm Christian nationalism. The orange were the sympathizers, 20% who lean that way. The green are the skeptics, 30% who are skeptical. The blue are the rejectors, 29% who actively reject it. So notice what's remarkable here. Every single line is flat. From late 2022 through all of 2024, these proportions haven't changed. So it's not surging or collapsing, it's a stable, organized identity that shapes where people gather, what media they trust, and how they vote. If sizes are stable, what's changing is where people cluster. By party, 53% of Republicans qualify as Christian nationalists versus 16% of Democrats, 22% of independents sit between. By media, far-right TV viewers are 66% Christian nationalists, Fox viewers 52%, mainstream network viewers 27%. This slide is important because it shows that the size of the Christian nationalist population hasn't changed, but its location has. It's now clustered inside one political party and one media ecosystem, which means belief, identity, and information are reinforcing one another. That's what makes conversations across difference feel so charged. We're not just talking across opinions, we're talking across meaning-making systems. So this slide shows that Christian nationalism isn't located in one kind of community. It shows up differently depending on place, class, and racial experience. In some regions, it's part of the cultural default. In others, it's much less common. Education and class shape the social worlds people move in, which influences how the identity takes form. And race especially frames the meaning. The same language about Christian nation can express very different moral and political stories in white, black, or Hispanic communities, because those communities have different histories of belonging and exclusion in America. So the key takeaway is Christian nationalism is not one thing. Its meaning shifts depending on context and community experience. So at this point, it's important to clarify that people are not usually becoming more traditionalist or more secular because of their church. What the research shows is that people choose congregations that match the worldview they already hold, which means that church becomes home for identity, not the source of it. And it happens across spheres. Congregations, eternal ideological coherence increases. Media ecosystems, people choose sources that confer meaning. Local communities, rural or interior versus metro coastal residence patterns map onto the same split. So religion becomes a home for identity more than the source of identity. Worldview drives worship choices, not the other way around. So now we can put the pieces together. What we're seeing is not the disappearance of religion, but a reorganization of three moral worlds. These aren't theological differences. They're differences in what people see as morally authoritative, what they believe is at stake in society, and what a good life looks like. First, the traditionalist moral world, about 30% of Americans. Here, moral authority is rooted in scripture and inherited sacred story. The highest value is continuity, sacred order, protecting what feels handed down and holy. In our data, this lines up with Christian nationalism, adherents, and sympathizers, that stable 30% that we tracked earlier. Second, the pluralist religious middle, roughly a quarter to a third of Americans. There are people who are of faith who value belonging across difference. Here, moral discernment happens in community through shared life and relationships. This often shows up in black churches, Hispanic congregations, mainline Protestants, and Catholic parishes. Third, the secular or spiritual but not religious world, roughly the same size as the traditionalist world. Here, moral authority comes from conscience, empathy, and reason. The core values are inclusion and authenticity. This maps with the religious unaffiliated and with the Christian nationalism rejectors. Now, an important clarification. These are broad patterns, not boxes. People are more complex than any model. There is overlap and movement, and race especially reframes what the same religious language means in different communities. So we're not labeling individuals, we're naming moral orientations that show up across congregational life. None of these groups are disappearing, they are stable but increasingly sorted. Because they draw on different sources of moral authority, they often talk past one another even when they care about similar issues. So for religious leaders, the task isn't just clear messaging, it's translation, bridge building, and helping people stay in relationship across difference. If we want to lead effectively, we need to understand not just what people believe, but what world they believe in. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So
I have questions on keyboard later.
Yeah, we have questions for your table, but are there clarifying questions that you want to ask? Because I know this is a lot of is very good information, but are there clarifying questions before we send you to talk about some of this? Yes.
The slide you just showed, the stability, I'm sorry, is the stability in each of the groups, are you tracking that from 22 to 24?
Yeah, so these are all studies like from, I'm using PRI studies, Gallup polls, and Pew Research from this past year. Yeah.
I was really intrigued by the data on Christian nationalism. The last slide you showed, I couldn't digest it, but it suggested that Christian nationalism is pretty well distributed throughout every race group. Is that what you're seeing? Because that's a surprise to me.
Yeah, thank you. I think we'll definitely be going into that more. Larisha will definitely go into that in the next talk that's coming up.
I won't super. Okay, 44% of Black Protestants per these measures would be considered Christian nationalists. 57% of Hispanic Protestants. This is part of what my part will complicate. My 93-year-old grandmother, who just passed away, would be considered a Christian nationalist. And so when we think about authoritarianism and various, like how culture and race inflect on belief, it's important to think about how these quantitative measures are capturing something important, but also it's very complicated, right? So I'll talk about that more in a minute.
In line with that question, in terms of the media landscape and what messages in media people are consuming, your takeaway point was it becomes harder to talk across difference because people are living essentially in different media landscapes or different worlds, as you put it. But it looked like the data showed that the information that people are consuming is actually quite diverse in terms of the, if I understood that slide. So I was curious, could you build on that point a little bit? If people are actually consuming more similar information, meaning the expectation was that people are consuming a certain avenue of news, but it's actually much more diverse than we expected. Wouldn't it be that we're actually living in similar worlds, but we're coming to different conclusions based on the media that we're consuming?
Do you have any thoughts on that, Larisha?
Wait, I didn't hear this.
Could you rephrase it just one more time? I'm sorry.
Are we essentially living in different worlds, or are we actually just consuming similar pieces of information and coming to different conclusions? I think the common narrative is actually, okay, we're living in different worlds, we're consuming far different information. You're consuming information from one news channel, I'm consuming from a different news channel. But actually this graph, and I think the point you made, was we're consuming similar pieces of information, we're coming to different conclusions.
I think it's the interpretation of this. The bottom graph, it shows, so the red, the adherents to Christian nationalism, 26% of them watch far-right TV news, and 18% Fox News, the sympathizers, right, 40%. So that's the divide that John Paul was pointing. So for the top two, the adherents and sympathizers are way over on Fox News and far-right TV, and then the skeptics and the rejectors, skeptics and rejectors, are way over on the either do not watch TV or watch mainstream news. Right. So it's not that 30% of skeptics and 2% of rejectors are watching far-right, are also consuming, right? It's that less of them, right? That's how you interpret that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the great majority who believe that are, you have the two sides. They have the majority of them are consuming very different sources of news. Does that make sense? Is that what more or less? What? Okay. All right. Are there any other clarifying questions? before we send you to talk about this in your
I think we
groups?
should, for time.
Do you want to, should we just go into your presentation, then we'll go into the question? Sure. Yeah, let's go, since your part already came up, go ahead. Let's do that, and then we'll have you talk in your tables. You can do it from there if you want.
Good morning. So I took seriously the impetus for the description of the conference as the first panel. I thought it would be, I'm a social scientist, but I was trained undergrad as a humanist. I studied history and sociology, political science. Biographically, my grandfather was a pastor. So I grew up in a black church. My moral formation was in a black Baptist church context in Oklahoma. And I say this to inflect what we were just speaking about. My 93-year-old grandmother would be considered by these measures, right, a Christian nationalist. And so this question of how, like the second paragraph of our charge here today, how are they influencing, meaning these numbers, religionists, influencing the politicization of religious communities, the deepening of moral and cultural divides, and the challenges and opportunities of living in an increasingly pluralistic nation? In what ways is religion and the church being used and misused in today's society, and how can religious leaders navigate this changing landscape? And I read that, and as I was having discussions with my colleague and friend, Dr. Tony Lin, I said, I think the people who are attending this conference are probably under the assumption that it's the other who are politicizing and polarizing the religious landscape. So this is where my questions and my thoughts are coming from. Many academic studies, inclusive of the data John Paul just presented, and a good deal of cultural critique place the onus of the burden for our current moment on one socio-political phenomenon in particular, namely white Christian nationalism. I would like to complicate, even confuse some terms here today. I will start with a few assertions, give some context, and finally ask some questions to you, my astute colleagues, about public theology in an age or a time of authoritarianism. Assertion number one, the right is cultish, like all of us. We participate in cults because we participate in culture. All cults have litmus tests, purity tests, symbols, and signs because that's what humans and societies do. Number two, the right is white, like the majority of you here today. So we need to accept that Black people have been, and others, defined by their group for a long time, but all of a sudden there's white identity politics. And by the way, people of color didn't invent identity politics. It's called white supremacy, and it's the foundation of this so-called democratic republic. By many quantitative measures, my 93-year-old Black grandmother is willing to engage in political science to save a sociological imaginary, the state. The right is capitalist, like most of you. Purveyors of neoliberalism, without acceding to the notion that racial capitalism has fueled American prosperity while killing people who look like me, who are Native, Indigenous, and other. The right is nationalist, like a lot of you, who identify with a nation state, civil religion, for example. American nationalism is by default a Christian form of nationalism. Yes, there are indeed many correlates and connections, statistically significant ones, between religion and the rise of authoritarianism in the US. But it's a global phenomenon that has been underway since at least 2015. My question for religious communities is, how are you and your communities collectively culpable for this moment? Authoritarianism is not a set of personality traits that coalesce in certain leaders of corrupt ethics. Donald Trump's moral formation occurred in mainline Protestant churches. You can critique his teachers, but he heard Norman Vincent Peale loud and clear. Authoritarianism does not arise in a historical and political vacuum. The writing was on the wall in 2015. My friends in Rwanda tell me about genocide. They say that when your leaders, the elites, the pastors, the rabbis, the imams, the shamans, the politicians declare one side good and one side bad, whether this side is ethnic or racial or political, and perpetuate the propaganda to back that view, everyone participates in the propaganda war. Today we call it TikTok shorts or Instagram reels or Twitter rants, or those of you behind the curve, Facebook posts. It's voter guides that dehumanize and demonize the opposition. It's bumper stickers that provoke a bumper crop of distrust of the person driving in front of you. So you peer into the window when you pass, but do you see someone like yourself or an enemy? This is how genocide begins. Labeling my neighbor the repugnant, moral, cultural, racial, religious other. We put white and Christian in front of nationalists, knowing how that lands in the public sphere. Genocidal ideology begins by sorting. You, I, we participate in us versus them. You are just like them. It's easy to get caught up in genocide. That's what my friends, the genocidaires in Rwanda, tell me. It's happening here, now. SNAP, on hold. ACA rates about to triple. Genocide by another name. Immigration raids, kids in cages, mass incarcerations. Your chosen cult, my chosen cult, is not superior, it's different. It's not courageous for us to be here today. It's corrective, and it's already too late. Sudan, Congo, Gaza. You have the platforms, the pulpits, the prayer stoles, the classrooms, confession closets, holy waters, holy books, the publics to oppose indifference and injustice as it unfolds. My final assertion. Scapegoating is easy. Solidarity is hard. Blaming the religious and political right may be a convenient scapegoat, but it does not constitute critique, and it certainly is not productive. Prophetic protest from the center of power gets high fives and amens and mm-hms from the chorus of your content, but it doesn't reach the margins. What good does your public theology do? Where does theodicy meet your public theology? The crisis of meaning being born, of religious folk failing to stand in embodied solidarity with suffering, from Hiroshima to Haifa, Baghdad to Bethlehem, Soweto to the south side of Chicago, blood cries out from the streets and from our own bloody hands. I believe that only political empathy, not sympathy, can move us on. We all sort us versus them. So let's get beyond complicity to responsibility, stop scapegoating the right, and start looking in our public theological mirrors. Thanks.
Thank you, Larisha. So I think, did you have any specific questions you want to? Okay, so let's spend about 15 minutes in conversation about both John Paul and Larisha's presentation just now, just to have, share your thoughts and how you're seeing some of this in your own communities, and then we'll call you back, and then we'll spend the last part of our time together trying to think of ways that we can be generative and build from here. So, yeah. And we can float, right? We can float around. Yeah. All right. I hope you've had some good conversations around the table. I'll use this one. I hope there were some good conversations, and I hope you will continue these conversations. Please share your information with each other. The PowerPoint that John Paul sent, a lot of that information, as you can tell, is from PRRI, so you can get that from there. But if you want some of this information, we can share it with you as well. And I don't know if you want to clarify, Larisha's granny did not storm the Capitol on January 6th. When she said she measures on Christian nationalism, PRRI actually asked five questions to measure for how likely, there was a range, right? Whether they agree or disagree with this question, how likely they were to believe in Christian nationalism. So that's what she means when she says her granny would have fit. And I think any Christian any Christian of any generation in any country, because my parents are immigrants, and they would have ranked on this, right? One of the questions is the laws of America should reflect the laws of the Bible, right? Something like that, Christian laws, Christian values, right? And, my parents are immigrants, I'm an immigrant, they would say yes to that. They would have said yes to that question. So you can look that up on there, what the Christian nationalism is. So now that we've seen this sorting, and this is very much, if you know Bill Bishop's work, right, the big sort, this is very much along those lines. But what we have here is a focus. What John Paul did for us is to focus on Christian and religious organization groups and our communities specifically, how that sort has been taking place. But now we want you, as leaders of religious communities, to think about what do we do next. We all know, we're all here, I think, because we know how serious our moment is and what we're facing. As a social scientist, I have to name the trinity of our discipline: Karl Marx, Max Weber, and Emil Durkheim. And in sociology, our three prophets, the founding scholars of our discipline, they warn us, right? They had nightmare scenarios of what would happen, right? Marx with the class wars, Durkheim with anomie, right? When institutions and meaning go away, Weber with the iron cage and the dehumanization of people, right? When you bureaucratize everything so much, you dehumanize people. And I feel like we are living the worst of their nightmares, right? This is beyond anything. The time that we're living in is beyond what they could imagine, and the speed at which it's happening is beyond anything they could imagine. But all three of them were obsessed with religion, right? All three of them saw something very critical in religion, whether it would perpetrate or replicate their nightmare scenarios. But I think, as a Christian, as a pastor, as a member of the clergy, I still have hope in religion. I always say I'm religious, not spiritual, right? I'm committed to the institution. I believe in the church as a Christian. So I think there's something there that we can do. And in thinking about this with some of my colleagues here and other places, I think the Western church and the U.S. church specifically has replicated and been absorbed into a neoliberalist mindset for the last 50 so years, right? And we have failed to be what the church is supposed to be. And by that I mean we've become obsessed with the 3 B's, right? To be a successful church, right? The pastor has a book deal, buildings, and butts on the seats, right? Numbers, right? It's all about numbers, which is not the purpose. But if you look at the history of the church, right, the greatest things that came out of the church, it wasn't happening in the sanctuary. It was happening in the basement. It was happening in the fellowship hall. From AA, right, all the recovery groups, to the civil rights movement, to the youth group and Sunday school education. It wasn't in the sanctuary. It was in the church basement. And so for all of us, I want us to spend the rest of our time here, the 15 minutes or so, to think and imagine, right? A lot of us still have fellowship halls and basements, and we can replicate it in our own kitchens. But what can we do, right? Now that we know that this sorting has happened and we are all sorted, and we're all complicit in this sorting, in this us versus them. What can we do, right, to overcome those divisions within our own context, with the limitation, but also the possibilities that we all have with the resources that we have. And hopefully we can generate some ideas of how we go forward to heal some of this divide, this us versus them mentality. So yes, please spend some time with the new friends that you've met here and think about that the fellowship hall, right, the church basement. How can you use that for the good of our democracy? Small task, but go for it. All right, I hope you've had some good ideas. We have a little bit of time. We have time for maybe one or two groups to share some ideas that you came up with. Are there any groups who would like to share what you came up with the rest of the group? I can hand you the mic. Do you all want to share something? I mean, just to get us going, right? Just these conversations, all these conversations, hopefully will go on beyond today. But if there are any ideas, any great convictions or any convictions you've had in these conversations, anyone like to?
If you can hear my voice, clap once. If you can hear my voice, clap twice. Thanks, I'm going to use that in my classes from now on. Okay. Any conversation?
Yeah, anybody want to
Comments?
share back with the group?
Insights?
So my neighbor here, Julie, just blew my mind because she was saying that she had a conversation with someone and they were talking about the word justice, and justice is a buzzword that can mean a lot of different things, and that one of the ways we can bridge these gaps is by defining our terms, because justice is all over the scriptures, right? But if you hear justice as to mean something that only leans one side or the other, then it might leave people out of the conversation or make them automatically think that they're not welcome in the conversation.
Yeah, one question that I was going to pose is like, who is a public theologian? Are Christian nationalists doing public theology? Yes, they are, absolutely. And it's to the point, right? Like, what does justice mean in that context? Like, one of the questions on the Christian nationalism scale is, I am willing to participate or condone violence to return America back to its foundational values. That looks like justice to some people.
Anyone on this side? This side
Sorry, I
hasn't talked.
can't help but start teaching class.
I know. Well, we're here all day. I hope that the oh, did you have? Yeah, sure. Yes.
I'm not entirely sure how to pose this, but I'm curious about interpretation of Scripture. This particular, we were talking about this one, this particular slide, right? That lands traditionalist moral world in our moral source being Scripture, covenant, inherited sacred story. And yet I would say that, right, as a more progressive theologian, that my moral source is Scripture and covenant and inherited sacred story, but I might read Scripture differently with a different lens or a different interpretive stance than people that are theologically different than me. So I'm not exactly sure what I'm asking, but I'm wondering if someone could talk about how that fits into these divisions, right? And how we interpret Scripture and what our theological sort of foundation is and how that filters into this.
John Paul is the New
Yeah, I
Testament
can try.
scholar.
I'll try to take a stab at it. But I guess you're touching on something that I feel like the presentation was trying to show was that those who I'm sure many here have heard of like Elizabeth Schlegelmilch of Fiorenza, very prominent feminist theologian, and one of her quotes that sticks with me, or an idea that she's always pushing, is that what you see depends on where you stand, right? And so you have, it seems like people are reading their scriptures based already on morality grounds that they have established outside of church, which is why we tried to frame the conversation about like how people are sent to silo themselves is not because of what church they go to, but they go to that church because of their values. I guess it's kind of like, it's a different framing, I guess, that we thinking about.
Yeah.
I was going to say it's like, well, I'm not answering this. I mean, if you can read the fine print, it says group names are interpretive categories describing broad orientations, not individuals. So, I mean, that's every social scientist disclaimer when you do an ideal type like this, right? Like back to Tony's Weber, that it's not perfect, right? And individuals may land differently, but we call that hermeneutics, right? Yeah. We're all reading our holy books from a different lens. And when I talked about my grandmother, and I couldn't elaborate because of time, the reason Black Christians and Hispanic Christians fit in so neatly is because there's a high level of paternalism, patriarchy within the Black church that persists to this day, high levels of authoritarianism instantiated in the Black pastor. And even to this day, when I hear the word pastor, I see a man in my head because of my background. And so I tell my students, I too am decolonizing my mind all the time. And that's the hermeneutic. So my grandmother did not show up on January 6th, like Tony tried to make a joke. I'm glad y'all didn't laugh at his joke. But the point is, she would assent to a lot of these 5 statements that constitute the Christian nationalism scale because of her hermeneutic. That is shaped and formed in a community, right? But we're not blank slates, and we know this. And so the interpretive lens, I believe when I'm talking about what does it look like to just acknowledge that we are part of the sort problem. We have contributed to the polarization that we're critiquing. The whole point of this first thing, Tony and I were like, this can't just be a Trump bashing session, right? We have to figure out how we're not just complicit, but collectively culpable, which is again, it's a hermeneutic in a very individualistic and atomistic, capitalistic society that says everything is about you and how you benefit in that calculus that is American capitalism, which has seeped into all of our churches. Mainline Protestants, guess how the majority of mainline Protestants voted? For DJT. If you didn't know, now you know. The majority of mainline Protestants voted for Trump. No one is absolved of this. So how do we take responsibility for the moment that has been festering? And I think, I'll give you the answer to my questions. I tell my students, we can't politic well if we can't human well. And if the religionists, the people sympathetic to religion, if we can't human well, we're screwed.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, thank you. So again, we're here all day. Let's continue the conversation. I hope you can continue the conversation forward. On the question of hermeneutic, we are a fairly new center and we're creating programs. So that's something I'm going to think about as something we offer as a center. And if you have ideas, the things that we could do at the Center for Public Theology and Public Policy that could help what you're doing out in the field, please reach out to me. My email is on the website. Reach out to me and see how we can partner to create programs that will be helpful. for all of us. Thank you.